Okay, let us get started here in just a moment.
Are we underwater still, or are we back above? Oh, that sounds better.
Okay, where's Suzanne? Okay, well, welcome everyone to our first ever NYPAPy hour, a preservation historians happy hour here live on Zoom. And since this is a happy hour, whatever beverage you happen to have handy, I will invite you now to join me in hoisting it aloft. And cheers.
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 Well, I don't know about you, but I am especially excited because the two people we have lined up for you this evening are people who do fantastic work. They are supremely knowledgeable, and I think even more importantly than that, they are just great people. And I know so many of you on the call know them and know that just as well as I do. So I am so excited to hear from them tonight, and just a chance to have an informal conversation and chat. And please do fire off any questions in the chat feature as we go. I'm going to be sort of the admin host for the evening and let the two of them focus on the conversation. I do also want to note that we are very grateful because we actually have some support from Jan Herd Picorni Associates, who are bringing this to you this evening. So thank you to JHP. And with that, I'm going to introduce NYPAP. We are the New York Preservation Archive Project, and I know many of you on the call know that. Some of you are even board members. I see Gina Pilar out there with a wonderful hat waving. And the Preservation Archive Project was founded specifically to home in on what have preservationists done in the city. What have they done to save some of the most outstanding examples of architecture, some of the most culturally significant, some of the most historically significant structures and sites in the city, as well as neighborhoods? Because I think all of us on this Zoom already know, but it bears repeating for us and for the broader public. Buildings do not save themselves. And there is a whole lot that goes into the effort to fight all kinds of different variables here in the city to make sure that some of these fantastic things remain as part of our urban experience. So that's what we're about. We're looking at archives, we're looking at papers, we're looking at oral histories, anything that helps to tell that story and keep those stories alive over time. So one of the stories that we'll be looking at tonight is an architect who crafted some pretty fantastic buildings in Brooklyn, primarily, and his name was Montrose Morris. Now, I'm going to turn things over to one of our board members who will be chatting with pretty much, I would say, the world's foremost expert on Montrose Morris, if you think that's fair. And
Yes, yes.
Excellent. I thought so. All right, but Susan De Vries, who is joining us here with a fantastic book backdrop, I must say. I recognize, you know, what is that interesting looking book with two gentlemen over there? Yes, what is that?
This would be Preserving New York by Anthony C. Wood.
Now, knowing Mr. Wood, is that paid product placement?
Absolutely.
Very nice. I would have expected nothing less. But Susan is one of our board members. She is also just generally knowledgeable about preservation in the city, and I find myself going to her with questions or asking her to attend events across one of the widest arrays and ranges of things that I can think of. But she is a historian. She has a real focus on preservation history, and she works for Brownstoner. She's a photographer. And if you are someone who is on Instagram, please be sure to follow her. Her tag is @StudioTinker, all one word. It's a fantastic site full of all sorts of really beautiful images. You always seem to get the lighting right somehow. I'm not certain how you do that, but please give me some tips. But without further ado, I'm going to introduce you now, Susan De Vries.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. It's great to see some familiar faces and names. And I'm excited for the conversation with Suzanne. I don't get to see her that often, so this is a fabulous conversation to have. And as Brad said, we're going to be focusing on Montrose Morris. And we have just a few questions that we have for Suzanne to kind of stir some informal conversation. As Brad said, please, if you have any questions, go ahead and put those into the chat, because very handily, Suzanne and I don't have to worry about that. Brad can deal with all that and pop in when there's an appropriate question to ask. But before we get to the questions, I just want to give a little bio for Suzanne. Although so many of us know her, I think it's important to read her full, impressive bio. I did a little editorializing, Suzanne.
No problem.
So Suzanne learned to appreciate architecture and history by growing up in Gilbertsville in upstate New York. After attending Yale University, where she majored in African American Studies with a concentration in music, she moved to New York City to pursue a career in opera. Her love of old houses led her to live in Bed-Stuy and Crown Heights, where she became interested in all things related to old house restoration, historic preservation, and community building. She's a longtime board member of the Crown Heights North Association, which has worked tirelessly for landmarking and National Register designation for that neighborhood. She is a columnist for Brownstoner, which is how I first got to know her. And her early work was written under the pen name of Montrose Morris, hence our conversation this evening. Her expertise on the architecture and history of Central Brooklyn has led to lectures, walking tours, which are fabulous. I've been on many, and research projects. She now lives in Troy, New York, and she is the vice chair of the Troy Community Land Bank there, has a seat on the Troy Planning Commission. And if you want to check out some of her other writing, she also has a great blog about Troy's fascinating history and architecture, and you can find that at spellenoftroy.com. So cheers, Suzanne.
Thank you.
And now let's get into the difficult questions that we've
Okay.
If you've joined this conversation, you may know a little bit about the architect Montrose Morris, but I thought maybe we could start off. He had such a prolific career that it's hard to encapsulate everything in a conversation like this. But Suzanne, if you could give us kind of that 2-minute, elevator speech, that quick overview about kind of who he was and within the context of his time, that would be great.
Okay. Well, Montrose Morris was a New Yorker. He was born in Hempstead, Long Island in 1861, and he grew up in Brooklyn, and most of his career took place in Brooklyn. And he was up and coming as an architect at a time when the profession of architect was really gaining significance. Before that, there were plenty of architects, but most of them were really regarded as more as like jumped up builders and advanced tradesmen. They didn't get the respect that architects get now, certainly, and they were just starting to get some respect back then. And he was one of a group of Brooklyn architects that really helped put architecture and Brooklyn architecture specifically on the map. He was building at a time when Brooklyn was growing by leaps and bounds, and people really wanted to have quality architecture, and he was just there at the right time. And the interesting thing about him, as compared to there are a horde of wonderful Brooklyn architects, but the thing about Montrose was that he invented himself in almost a 21st century sort of starchitect mode. He made sure he knew all the right people. He went to all the right parties. He joined all the right clubs. He lived in the right neighborhood, and he really only catered to wealthy people. He wasn't one of those guys who was going to come out and volunteer to build, affordable housing. He wanted to build mansions and fancy apartment buildings and all that So we know a lot more about him because he was in the press all the time. He probably today would have had a publicist, but he was his own publicist, and he was everywhere. Education-wise, he didn't go to architecture school. Most of the guys back then didn't. He apprenticed with Charles Clinton and Hamilton Russell, and both of them were incredibly influential Manhattan architects. They built the 7th Regiment Armory on Park Avenue, the Apthorpe and the Graham Court Apartments. And so they were really, really well regarded, and he learned everything he knew from them. And after 7 years of apprenticeship, he went out on his own. He opened an office on Exchange Place down in Lower Manhattan, and that was a great place. Most of the guys in Brooklyn were on Court Street, but his offices in Manhattan allowed all of his rich clients to just come over there because they all had their businesses there, and it really worked out well for him.
That's great. And as we as I mentioned in your intro, you used his name as your nom de plume when you were first writing for Brownstoner. Why him in particular? Was it just the name, the double M, that drew you? Was it just was it something about his architecture? Like, what made you choose that as your kind of secret identity?
Well, as it turned out, it was more of a nom de guerre, a nom de plume, because writing on that or commenting on that blog in those days was really, could get quite contentious. And we were all anonymous because we didn't want people to know who we were. And so anyway, I chose him because I had lived in Bed-Stuy for almost 30 years. And then I had recently moved to Crown Heights. And when I started posting on Brownstoner, I had lived in Crown Heights for a couple of years. And I just wanted to pick an architect whose work was in both neighborhoods. It was as simple as that. I loved his work. And so I chose the name Montrose Morris. I chose it in part because he was a man and I'm not a man. And there was such contention on the blog at times. It really worked out well to not be known to be a woman. There were some really crazy people on there for a while. And
yes.
So and then I just became known as MM, and there's still people today who call me MM when I see them. So it really worked out well.
I've read some of those comments on the very early stories. They are interesting.
Yeah.
Don't imagine.
You mentioned that he was building a lot, that he was, seeking these wealthy clients. Roughly how many buildings have you been able to kind of attribute to him so far? And then how many of those, very roughly, do you think still survive out there?
Actually, I think I found about 50 if you include each row house in a group as a single building. Mm-hmm. I started to count them at one point and then didn't have time to really dig into it and never got back to it. But I think 50 is a good number. And I think most of them are still standing. The only ones that are not were some that were in Williamsburg and a few others. But by and large, most of his stuff is still standing. Unfortunately, his own home is one of the things that's not standing. And if you go, Brad, to the picture before that, no, before that one, number 2. Yeah, that one. That is the 1940s Municipal Archives tax photo of Montrose's house. It's gone now. There's a big empty lot between the house on the corner and the one next to it on the left. He built that house as a wedding present for his wife-to-be. And no sooner had they gotten married and she moved in than he opened it up to a huge open house and invited potential clients and potential investors to come see what his style was like and build their own houses. And the newspapers went crazy over it. They thought that, it was just spectacular. And they said that over 25,000 people trooped through his house to see it. I don't believe that number is accurate, but a lot of people went in there. I don't think his wife was too happy about it because the description in the paper talks about people looking in the closets and just going everywhere, snooping around looking at this house. But it was a great success for him as an architect. And a lot of the features that were in this house are used in most of his houses. He put in a balcony in the parlor and all kinds of fancy stuff. And so it ended up being used in most of his residential architecture and in his apartment buildings.
That's great. And yeah, that Brooklyn Daily Eagle article is pretty fabulous, describing
Yeah, it's very
house.
descriptive.
It's like, yes, a gift for the bride, but maybe more of an advertising piece than anything else. So you said roughly about 50, and many of those survive. What role do you think kind of landmarking designation has played to ensure that those buildings have survived? And kind of corollary to that, do you think many of his facades are intricately ornamented and they're really kind of stunning when you see them up close? Does that make them an easier sell for designation than perhaps a more modest house?
Well, fortunately, most of what ended up being landmarked, most of his houses are most of his buildings are landmarked. I would say 80% of the ones that I know about are.
Mm-hmm.
They're in Crown Heights North, they're in Bedford Stuyvesant, they're in Stuyvesant Heights, Clinton Hill, and fortunately that protected them because a lot of them I don't think would be here if they were in any other neighborhood that wasn't landmarked. His buildings were pretty ornate, and Park Slope too. I forgot Park Slope. Even when he changed styles, when styles changed from the Romanesque and the Queen Anne to more of a classical Renaissance revival style, he changed along with them. And his buildings from that later period are just as ornate in their own way as the earlier ones, which are just totally festooned with all kinds of terracotta and stained glass and different materials and just classic Queen Anne kind of stuff with a little of everything everywhere. And
Suzanne, is there any particular one in the photo set that we should go to illustrate that? And I'll try to avoid going into my email at this point.
Did everybody see your email?
Yes.
I did.
Good thing we all have a drink in hand. It's all fine.
Yeah, if you start back where we left off, like after his house.
Okay. It'll be email for a moment here, but we'll get to it quickly. 1 second. There we go.
Okay,
Right.
The next one. That's the only interior photograph that exists that's his house, the interior of his house. So you can see that he had that double floored parlor with the, the banister around it. And he did these really ornate fireplaces that sort of look like Swiss ingle nooks. They had these huge hoods that come out. You can see that in the center of the photo. And he definitely believed that more was more. And as you can see, he put stuff everywhere. So the next one, that's a drawing that was in the Eagle. That's that same fireplace on the left there. It's hard to kind of make out. He did really wonderful coffered ceilings and just, he decimated forests for his houses. There's just tons of woodwork everywhere.
Suzanne, do the archives of his firm, or I think his sons have a successor firm, do those exist anywhere? Is there any archival treasure trove out there that you were able to go through to?
No, I don't think his stuff survived. If it did, nobody's found it yet. And I think Andrew Dulcart was going to write a book about Morris and about 4 or 5 other architects, and he was looking for material from all of them, and I don't think he was ever able to find anything.
Do you think,
It's really
Susan
too
or,
bad.
do you think, Susan or Suzanne, that Brownstoner would be willing to put up a reward for anyone who finds the Montrose Morris archives?
You mean like a case of beer or something like that?
Yeah, that'd be about it. But
I think it's interesting because you said, you know, it's a corollary, if you will, to today. Like, he was so busy promoting himself and his contemporary work, but he didn't then ensure that his legacy really survived beyond, I mean, the buildings, but not the kind of documentation of who he worked with. And it'd be
Right. Well,
fabulous to see like a floor plan.
part of the problem was, well, he left his business to his two sons, neither of which had very much talent, and they were, you know, they just didn't have it. And plus, to their credit, it was the times had changed, and all the stuff that he did and made his name on wasn't popular anymore. We're going into the teens and 20s, and they were just decent journeyman architects. They weren't anything special. And the other problem is, he lived really large, and he spent really large, and he died poor. So his wife ended up getting kicked out of the house. She had to move because he had mortgaged it, and they couldn't afford to pay it. So he messed them up, and so I would imagine that a lot of the records were just lost in, you know, whatever.
Susan, we have a question from the audience. This is from Gregory Dietrich. Does Morris's work speak to the rise of Brooklyn as a commuter suburb to Manhattan? In other words, were many of his clients actually living in his buildings in Brooklyn? Is that how it played out?
Yeah, most of his ridiculously rich clients had businesses in Lower Manhattan, and they commuted. They took the bridge after that was built, and they do what people do today. They can commute to Manhattan within 40 minutes or so, depending on where you're going. And it worked then and it worked now. And that's why, part of the reason why Brooklyn developed into such a big city, it was known as much for its residential areas as for its industry and everything else. But that building in the photograph here, that's the Alhambra apartment building. And that's probably my favorite Montrose Morris building. He did a whole lot of great apartment buildings, and he was one of the first in Brooklyn to build luxury apartment buildings. And this was at a time when rich people really didn't want to live in apartment buildings. They didn't like the idea of having neighbors right outside their door and above them, around them, below them. And they really associated living in apartments as living in tenements. And, who would want to do that? So the architects and the developers of the day really had to outdo themselves in providing the most luxurious and special kind of buildings that people would want to live in. I mean, this happened with, the Dakota in Manhattan and all the other early apartment buildings. They had to make the apartments as luxurious as a brownstone or a townhouse. And he did it. The next picture, I believe, shows an interior.
Ooh.
Yep, overdone, but it was very luxurious. It had pocket doors that opened between the parlors. And if you were entertaining, the apartments were 7 to 9 rooms. And if you were entertaining, you would just fling open the doors, and you had just as much room, if not more, than your brownstone. And originally you could see the storefronts on the ground floor. Those were not there. And originally the building had a big dining room for the tenants, and they had croquet courts in the backyard, and they had fountain, and it was just, they had servants' rooms up in the attic, and they had people who would run errands for you. It had telephones. So it was really, really up to date for its day. That building dates from 1888, 1889. And Montrose Morris and the developer who he worked with on all of his apartment buildings, a guy named Louis Seitz, they were only 25 years old when they did this. So that's pretty amazing.
Suzanne, one question from the audience. Sorry to cut you off, Susan. how many families or how many units did a building like this actually contain? Do you have any sense of that?
Well, this building's actually 2 units that are joined in the center with some arches and some detail. And I believe there were only about 20 units in the whole building.
Wow.
Okay. Thank you.
So that's pretty spacious. And when I first moved to Crown Heights, I met someone who was a child in the 50s, and his parents had friends who lived in the Alhambra, and he remembers it being these huge 7-room apartments that were kind of old and tattered at the time, but certainly still wonderful. Today, that building is affordable housing, and when they converted it to affordable housing, they stripped all the details out. So, and they made the apartments smaller. So there's nothing original on the inside anymore, unfortunately.
And
Oh, go ahead, Brad.
sorry, Susan.
That's okay.
Suzanne, this is in Bed-Stuy, correct?
Correct.
Okay. And do you know the street, the intersection we're dealing with here?
Yeah, that is Nostrand Avenue is the long street, and this is the Halsey Street end on the photograph, but it's between Macon and Halsey. It takes up the whole block.
Okay, great. Thank you. Again, just answering one of the questions from the feed.
Okay.
Oh, go ahead.
That's all right. I was just going to ask you, you mentioned, you know, that his house was kind of his, here I am, I'm an architect, hire me. Where does the Alhambra fit into his career? Was this, you know, the height? Was this him showing off early on? Where does it fit?
This is early on showing off, and it'd be hard to top yourself after this. He actually, he got lazy sometimes because there was an apartment building in Brooklyn Heights on Hoyt Street that looked almost exactly like that. So he was not above copying himself. And but this was early Montrose in the sort of Queen Anne Romanesque revival phase of his career. With Louis Seitz, he went on to develop at least 4 or 5 more apartment buildings. One of them is also in Bedford-Stuyvesant, just a block away from this one, and we've got a picture of that somewhere. Let's see. And another one is in Crown Heights. That's it. This is called the Renaissance, and that's you can see the Alhambra down at the end of the block there behind. Yeah, exactly. Renaissance was built in 1892, and he had changed his style by then. This was more classic, more sort of Loire Valley inspired. You'll notice he's got towers here too. Towers are one of his things. Almost all of his buildings, if he could stick a tower in a corner, he would. And this one has some wonderful details to it. And this one's on the corner of Hancock and Nostrand. And the third really spectacular one is called the Imperial. That's the Imperial. And that one's also 1892. And that one is in Crown Heights North. And that's on the corner of Bedford Avenue and Pacific Street, between Pacific and Dean. So they're all wonderful buildings. They were all built for luxury. This one only had 25 apartments in it originally, and all 3 of them are now affordable housing.
With the Alhambra, there was that great interior photo, which was fabulous. I've seen a few interior shots of his buildings pop up in the Eagle, but you know, since the archives don't exist, like where did you find that particular historic image, and do you find many of the interiors?
Well, my friend Morgan Munsey, who's also a Bed-Stuy resident, former Brownstoner, not a contributor, but poster, and an architectural historian, he and I are both obsessed with finding these things, and he found the other 2.
Okay.
And shared them with me.
That's great.
He's great.
Yeah, that's
We're going to write a book together, so you know, we're working on it.
Yeah, well, just to find those interior, it's one thing to see the exterior of the buildings, but to understand how people at the time really lived in that space and kind of that the lavishness he had on the exterior was kind of reflected on the interior.
Oh, definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So between the Alhambra, the Renaissance, the Imperial, was that kind of his, I don't know, 5-year high point? Like he was producing kind of some of his best buildings within this
Well, in addition to these buildings, he was also building a lot of row houses and a lot of mansions. The row houses were mostly in Bed-Stuy on the same block as his own home. He did the house on the corner with the tower, and then there's two groups next to it going east, and there's a group across the street. There's a mansion across the street he built for a man named John Kelly. And he has some more houses elsewhere in Bed-Stuy and apartment buildings in Bed-Stuy and Stuyvesant Heights. And there's some row houses in Clinton Hill. He was all over the place. And his stuff is very distinctive if you know what to look for. And but they were all upper middle class to upper class townhouses for wealthy people.
And Brad, I think there's a photo of the Kelly house in the slide.
Yeah.
That would be a good kind of contrast to that. There it is.
Yep, that's the Kelly house. Kelly invented a water meter that was very popular, made him a millionaire. And this is almost directly across the street from Montrose's own house. So he bought up a lot of land on this particular block. This is Hancock between Marcy and Tompkins in Bedford-Stuyvesant. And fortunately, this entire area finally got landmarked in 2015 after years and years and years of people working on it. And so that house was owned by a woman who was running a B&B for a while, and she sold it. It sold for 6-point-something million, which was the largest amount of money for anything in Bed-Stuy. And goes to show you how the neighborhood has, you know, gone from being quote unquote the, you know, worst ghetto in America to, you know, 6-point-something million houses. So it's a wonderful house. It's completely still a one family except for the very top floor, and it's got all the details in it still, all the woodwork and the fireplaces and the whole bit. It's great.
I think you can see some kind of old real estate listings still online of some of the interiors. So if anyone wants to take a look, that's great. Let's maybe flip to another house and see what that.
And we do have a few questions from the chat too.
Sure.
Do you know, Suzanne, anything about the artisans involved, especially with respect to the terracotta or the stonework on any of these buildings?
Unfortunately not, which was also another conversation that Andrew Dolkart and I have had on occasion. He has tried to find them and he can't either. There were several terracotta companies in New York that he probably used, and a lot of this stuff, I have a feeling some of it was probably commissioned specifically for like maybe this mansion, but a lot of his stuff on the row houses probably came out of a catalog. Might have been a higher end catalog than some of the other ones that were out there. But most of the stuff that all of these guys used, you know, they went to the catalog, flipped through the pages and said, okay, I'll take, 10 number 405s and, you know, all that kind of stuff. So, today this is so special and so beautiful and unique. And I have gazillion pictures of details of Brooklyn architecture, and I love it. But back then that was just what you did. You decorated your building, and that was part of the aesthetic at the time. So this is the Hulbert's mansion. This is on Prospect Park West and First Street, and it is now today the Poly Prep Elementary School. And this is actually a twin mansion. He did several twin mansions for fathers and daughters, as a daughter got a wedding present, get to live next door to dad. And so there's usually a larger part of the house on one side, which was the parent, and then the smaller one on the other. And in this case, the right side of the picture was the parent's house, and the left side was the daughter's house. But they're both, again, you can see Morris's trademark stuff going on. He's got his towers, he's got his loggias, which are the little enclosed porches with the columns in front of them, tons of stained glass and ornamental stuff. And the interesting thing about this house from an architectural point of view is that he built it in white sandstone at a time when everybody else was doing brownstone. And he actually did a brownstone mansion for Mr. Feltman, who invented the hot dog, elsewhere in Park Slope that's long gone. But at the same time, he built this one, and it just makes it even more unique because it really stands out as a beautiful, white, gleaming, giant mansion. I think I have a detailed picture next.
Okay, let's take a peek. Okay, there we go.
Yeah. So he's got everything in there. That swirly ornamental stuff is called Byzantine leaf. And over to the very right, you've got a green man carved into a panel there. You've got all kinds of wonderful stuff. The columns have etchings on them. And it seems like every space he could find to put some ornament, he did. And I can't tell if that is stone or terracotta. It could have been either one. It looks like stone, and since it was an expensive mansion, it might have been. But, you know, it's got wrought iron. He's got everything in here. It's really quite cool.
And they can be very deceptive to photograph because you see them from a distance and they're large and impressive, but you don't see the fine kind of level of detail until you really get up close.
Yeah, with the zoom lens.
Yeah, exactly.
This photograph is that is, I think, 21 Prospect Park West. And this was it was for sale. It's a Corcoran photograph. And, but that's a typical interior where he went with the double-storied parlor. And so you can see also on the very right, really intricately carved woodwork on the stairs and just woodwork everywhere. And this looks spectacular here, but this was in a lot of the mansions that he did and a lot of the row houses.
And is this typical, Suzanne? I mean, are there interiors intact in the bulk of the ones that you are attributing to Montrose Morris?
I'm not sure because I haven't been in a lot of them. Whenever they come up for sale, I save the pictures.
Right.
I know that the Hulbert Mansion had a upper story like this in one part of the house. His own house had it, and till it burned down. The house next door that's on the corner had one. It's very much changed now. And I wouldn't be surprised if there weren't a few more that I've never been in that also had this.
Okay. One other question that's cropped up amidst all this is, were the fire escapes on the Renaissance original, were they sort of designed as part of the structure or were they added later?
They were added later.
Okay.
Yeah, this picture is from when Jennifer Connolly and Paul Bettany owned 17 Prospect Park West, and that was the dining room. So again, you can see the quality of workmanship that he did. That particular house was built around 1896 or so, I think. And so the style on the outside changed as far as that one is a limestone. But basically inside, he kept the same ideas, the coffered ceilings, lots of woodwork, etc.
And Suzanne, his career ended. He died in 1916, right?
That's
so
correct.
He never went truly modern. He kind of stayed within this wheelhouse.
Well, he started out with Romanesque Revival and Queen Anne. Mm-hmm. He merged into Renaissance Revival, which is a really different aesthetic. And he's pretty much stayed there. By the time he died, I'm about to be photobombed by my cat.
Excellent.
By the time he died in 1916, he was only 54.
Right.
And, he was still in the sort of, well, he started to do some colonial revival kind of stuff. His last houses, which we don't have pictures of here, are in Prospect Park, I'm sorry, Crown Heights South. And those are three double duplex houses that are really in a sort of colonial revival kind of style. So he went through 3 or 4 styles and was still doing well when he died.
Great. And we are looking at the St. George here now, correct?
Yep, he designed the addition that's on the right with the flags on the roof. That was one of his huge commissions. It really, made his career because the St. George was such a prominent hotel. And I think with that, after the Roth edition, which is not in this picture, it was the largest hotel in New York, including Brooklyn and Manhattan. So it really, did a lot for his career as far as, I did the addition for the St. George, and it's cool. He added his stuff on there, you can see.
Yeah, and for those who don't, this is Brooklyn Heights, and his portion of it, it's the portion that faces Clark Street. Is that correct?
Yes.
His addition?
It's on the right side. Yes, yeah, exactly.
Clark. Great. Great. Do you remember, you can go ahead and click to the next one, Brad, but I just had a question pop into my head, but I'm seeing lots of questions come in from people too. But Suzanne, do you remember the first Montrose Morris building that you identified or that you saw?
Well, his own house,
house.
Where his house was, and the house next door.
The first one you saw in real life, the first one you saw still standing.
Oh, the first one in real life was the Alhambra.
Oh, okay.
I'll never forget, my mom and I were looking for a house, and we came up out of the subway on Nostrand Avenue, the A train, and turned around, and there was the Alhambra, and I was like, whoa. And, I said, okay, I can live here. I didn't care. The Alhambra was falling apart at the time, and it was really ratty looking, and but it was so beautiful. And as we walked around the neighborhood, it was just so great, and I really loved it immediately. But that was my first Montrose Morris building.
Oh, that's great. Excellent.
Now what we're looking at here is, this is a house that was built on St. Mark's Avenue in Crown Heights North, between New York and Brooklyn Avenue. And it was for a man named Siemens, Clarence Siemens. And Mr. Siemens was the owner of the largest office supply company in the world at the time. His company made Remington typewriters and all kinds of other office equipment. And the man was stinking rich. And at the time, the St. Mark's Avenue was the center of what was called the St. Mark's District. And this was one of the wealthiest enclaves in Brooklyn, far surpassing the Heights and sort of equal to Prospect Park West and 8th Avenue in Park Slope and Clinton Avenue in Clinton Hill. And this house cost, it was built in 1900. This house cost over $1 million to build at a time when most people's homes cost about $12,000 to build. And he and Clarence Siemens went to Europe, and they bought stuff out of chateaus and all this other places, brought them back and tossed them in there. And the house was just incredible. It was written up in the Eagle, and they, described everything. It had all the bells and whistles. It's a ridiculously huge house. I mean, it stretched all the way, the lot stretched all the way back from St. Mark's to Bergen. There was a carriage house that was accessible through a tunnel that went underneath the back lawn. And, it was just more. And the thing about it is, this is gone now. It was built in 1900. It was finished about 1902 or so. And Clarence Siemens lived in it for about 10 years, and then he died, and his wife thought it was too much house for her, and it went to a couple of other people. It became an event space, and by 1928, it got torn down, and there's a big apartment building in there now. So you know, it's one of the great losses, I think, because that would have been such a spectacular building to have kept, but it's long, long, long gone. And it's a really good apartment building that replaced it. And it's sort of interesting to think that a building that held one family and their servants now is a building that has like 200 apartments in it. So really a change in how, you know, cities change over the years.
Mm-hmm. Brad, I'm seeing a lot of questions coming in. Did we want to kind of transition to some
of those?
53
of them.
Let's shift to Q&A proper, absolutely. One question that I wanted to throw out just to kick things off, Suzanne, was I think the three that are individual landmarks of the ones we've seen are the Alhambra, the Imperial, and the Renaissance, if I'm not mistaken. Do you know when those were designated as individual landmarks and how? Who actually pushed?
Well, they're both, yeah, I think 1982 for all three of them. And I could be wrong on that, but I'm within a couple of years of it.
Okay.
And they were all designated because people like Andrew Dolkart especially, and he was with LPC at the time, and others really recognized that the architecture in Bedford-Stuyvesant and Crown Heights North was worthy of preservation. And because of the economic hardships in those neighborhoods, if they didn't go out and landmark it, it might not be here. And fortunately, they landmarked the Alhambra only a couple of years before there was a huge fire in one corner of it. And, you know, any other day of the week, they probably would have let the building go even further and then torn it down. And because it was landmarked, it was saved.
Got
And
it.
Also buildings like the boys' high school and girls' high school were also landmarked about the same time as individual landmarks, preserving them or they'd be gone too.
Okay. We have one question from George Calderaro that ties in with those buildings. So I'll unmute you now, George. And
and I'll unmute myself. Can you hear me?
Feel free.
Yep, can hear you.
Oh, okay, great. No, my question was just, Suzanne, good to see you again.
Yes, you too.
You mentioned that they are affordable housing. Does that mean that they're city-owned? And how much or how well are the interiors maintained? I live on the same street as an SRO, the St. George in Curry Hill. And it's beautifully maintained. It's a National Register landmark, but I'm just wondering how much of the integrity is afforded to the current residents, and what does affordable housing mean? Does that mean it's city-owned or it's not 19?
They're all privately owned. I'm not sure who owns them outside of that. Affordable, you know, that's a loaded word, but my friend Morgan has told me that he has seen ads in the Alhambra. The rents are creeping up. So, you know, I don't know. They're not affordable in terms of being only $500-700 a month or something like that. I think they're rising up towards market rate.
But is some of the interior able to be, is some of the interior maintained? It's all gutted. Okay, all right.
Yeah, from what I've heard, I know the Imperial was completely gutted, and I've heard that, I've never been in any of them, unfortunately, but I heard that all three of them were completely gutted.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. We're going to go next to James Rusiello, who had a question for you, Suzanne. One moment as I unmute you, James. Let's see here. Try one more time. Well, I'm not sure if we'll be able to get him on audio, but let me just go back to his question here in the feed, which was about how many designs do you believe Montrose's firm executed? If you assume 80% of the known designs are designated, that's not too many that are actually surviving.
I believe most of his stuff does survive. I don't know. I've never had the opportunity to go down to the buildings department and look at blueprints or anything like that, unfortunately. I have to say, when I was doing most of this research, I was working full-time writing for Brownstoner, and it was like dusk to dawn trying to do most of my stuff on the computer. So a lot of things I didn't really have the wherewithal to really check up on. But most of his residential architecture, his row houses, have basically the same physical setup as most of the row houses of the time, with double parlors, bedrooms upstairs, a couple of them on Hancock. There's one in particular that has a fourth floor ballroom, but that was that was not usual. But they were all pretty much the same general layout.
Okay. All right. And I see now James, who was had asked that question, has also just shared a bunch of information in the feed, so those on the chat can take a look. According to the newly enhanced beta version of the LPC map, there are 54 structures designated by Montrose Morris in designated historic districts.
Oh, it's great.
Yeah, so a new source of information that everyone can use.
And then plus the 3 individual landmarks. So
Right.
yeah, that's great.
Right.
And I can think of at least maybe 6 or 7 more that I know of that are in non-landmarked places.
Ah, okay. Let's see here. There's a question that goes to Morgan and to Suzanne, so let me just unmute Morgan here for one moment. 1 second here. And this question is coming from Deb. Let's see here. Okay, Morgan, you are unmuted.
Hi, Morgan.
Hey, Morgan.
Hello, everybody.
Okay. And Deb, let me get you on so you can ask your question. Go right ahead.
Am I wrong in remembering that you and Morgan found a Montrose Morris row house that hadn't been recognized before? You discovered something about it and said that looks like a Montrose Morris, and then found out that yes, it was?
Yeah, we found a couple of buildings that we suspected we call them Montes. And yeah, there were a couple of apartment buildings, and
There's a few on Herkimer Street,
Yeah, on Herkimer Street. There were a couple.
One that you found that was really interesting. I thought it was. We wish you could see it, but it actually Robert Moses put his BQE right through it, so that one's gone in Williamsburg. But I would love to have seen that one. I think that would have been a cool apartment building.
Yeah,
go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say there's probably more of them out there, but unless one has all the money and time in the world to investigate, it's really, you kind of guess from his style and the time period that could be one, and then we sort of go from there and start digging. And once in a while, when I'm digging around in the Real Estate Record and Buildings Guide or the Brooklyn Eagle, I'll run across that he did something, and then I try to find it. So we found a couple that way too.
Very nice.
Most recent ones I found was the one in, I think, it's Seagate. It was a church he did in Seagate that I had no idea he did churches. So
Really? Is that the first church that you've kind of associated with him?
No,
yes.
he did
Sorry.
another one.
No,
He
that's
did
right.
one on Lafayette Avenue that is today, it was for the Christ Scientists at the time. Today it's a Pentecostal church. It's a little church that's on Lafayette near Grand and Classen, I think, sort of near Pratt.
Also,
And
St. James,
that's
right?
the only other church that I can think of.
Did he do the one on St. James?
No, I
St.
don't
James
think
in
so.
Lafayette? Was that Lafayette and St. James?
No, it's down a little farther towards Bed-Stuy.
Okay.
But yeah.
Well, thank you very much.
Thanks,
We
Morgan.
have sort of a question and observation from Matthew Cootie. So let me unmute you, Matthew, and then we'll probably have time for maybe one more question, but I want to make sure everyone can get out in time to do their clapping at 7. So one moment here, Matthew, and go right ahead.
All right. Well, this one's pretty self-serving, but I see a lot of similarities between his work and Lamb and Rich. And mainly I say that because I live in a Lamb and Rich building in Greenpoint, the Astral, I'm sure you know it.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, it's beautiful. 1885 to 6, I believe. And anyway, I was just kind of curious of what your thoughts were comparing the two firms or architects and that kind of thing. And I know they were very much like a very elite kind of design firm at the time. But anyway, just curious what you thought.
Well, all those guys at that general time period between about 1884 and 1890 or so, they were all working within that Queen Anne and Romanesque revival sort of style. So they were all able to buy their stuff from the same people. So I think it's kind of inevitable that they probably sort of fed off each other in a way in terms of being influenced, or maybe one of them walked past another building by somebody else and said, "Oh, I like that. I'm going to use that next time I have to do something." And I mean, that happens today too. But yeah, I love the Astral. That is a wonderful building. I've never compared the two. That would be an interesting comparison, Montrose and Lamb and Rich.
Okay. Thank you very much, Matthew. Anyone else out there with any last questions? I know, Kate, I know you had some points about interiors. Have those been answered? If not, I can certainly unmute you if you wanted to note those. Kate Corcoran. One moment here. Let's just check in. All answered. Okay, wow. Susan and Suzanne, you are thorough to a T.
Excellent.
Well, if I had, the time and a good PowerPoint, I could bore people for hours with this stuff. He did so many buildings, so many details, and there's so many stories about him as a man in Brooklyn at the time. So he's a fascinating guy. And can I do a plug?
Oh, yes, please.
Yes.
I worked on this book with some fabulous people from Prospect Park South, on Prospect Park South. And it just came out. I just got it today. Yay.
Exciting.
Very nice.
So the Prospect Park South Association is going to be selling them. I don't think they're ready to do it yet, but bother them and get a book.
Okay, wonderful. And now I am going to unmute everyone so that you can show your thankfulness and maybe a little bit of applause even for our dynamic duo this evening.
Thank you, Suzanne.
Thanks, Susan. Hey, Suzanne.
Suzanne, thank you.
Again.
Samuels, I saw your name.
And everyone have a wonderful weekend. If you enjoyed what you saw this evening, please do feel free to donate at the link that I posted in the chat, because we like to give our guest speakers a little honorarium for their time in thanks.
Great.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. It was fun.
Safe, everyone. Cheers.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
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 Take care.
Glad, let us know when her book is out.
Yes.
Send an email. Thank you.
Everybody disappeared.
Suzanne, do you have like a mailing list or something, some such thing like that?
My email is Suzanne Spellen 26@gmail. So just toss me a line.
Okay, great. Thank you so much.
And don't forget to check out her blog on Troy as well. I think there's a link to that.
Oh, great. I have a lot of friends up in Troy, so that's
Oh,
fantastic.
great.
Oh, wonderful.
Great.
Thanks for coming, Neil.
Thanks.
Well, from 3 hours earlier. It's a whole time travel thing going on here. So,
Yeah.
These days, I'll believe it.
okay, take care. Love you guys.
Take care.
Yeah.
Thank you both.
Bye.
Thank you.